Hello and welcome back to part 2 of lecture 18 on moral skepticism. In the first part video, we discussed Friedrich Nietzsche, introduced who he is, you know, kind of gave a little bit of background in terms of his upbringing and talked a little bit about his academic works in general, the time period, that he's writing his works and so on. Introduced another not nearly as well known German philosopher who came on the scene shortly before Nietzsche named Arthur Schopenhauer, this dude. So I did go get the 2-volume set I alluded to in the part 1 video. This is The World as Will and Representation. This is what set Nietzsche off on his philosophical journey. And by the way, this is that obscure collection of essays by Schopenhauer that I read that essay on suicide in that I alluded to. So we talked about Schopenhauer and his, the numerous ways in which he influenced Nietzsche, but most notably, his his nihilism, his this idea of resignation from life, and how that then sort of fundamentally ignites this project on the part of Nietzsche for really his philosophical project of then combating that sort of negativity, you might say, on the part of Schopenhauer regarding life. So we talked a lot about that. We juxtaposed, right, Nietzsche's affirmation of life or life affirmation, embracing life in its entirety. We juxtaposed that then with the idea of nihilism, which you see shine through in Schopenhauer and his pessimism and his resignation from life. But then also we talked about how, Nietzsche would identify more mild versions of nihilism as well, and basically anybody that we would refer to as religious, or anybody that subscribes to a traditional moral theory, they're all going to be nihilists in the sense in which Nietzsche talks about nihilism. And we also talked about all the different ways that he's misunderstood. And it's interesting or ironic in some sense that when people talk about nihilism, for a good reason sometimes, he is a moral nihilist after all. When they think about nihilism or talk about nihilism, one of the first people they associate with the term is Nietzsche. But of course, his entire philosophical project, again, is aimed at combating what he means by nihilism, which, as I tried to, delineate in that first part video, basically amounts to rejection of our earthly life, right? Devaluing it in some sense. And we talked about then his labels, right? How he's going to label one who does that, right? Has a mentality where they tend to behave that way, where they tend to devalue earthly life. That is one who Nietzsche will describe as a slave. And then one, conversely, who embraces, affirms life in its entirety, that will be one who Nietzsche labels as a master. So we've kind of laid all the groundwork for then us diving into this in more detail here in the part 2 video. We did flesh out, though, a lot of his more general musings, right? The idea of naturalism, how we shouldn't take recourse, have recourse to any, supernatural appeals when explaining anything in our experience, okay? Because we have no evidence for such supernatural explanations. We talked about his reductionism, right, and how that is implicitly at odds with the notion that there are any standards or truths in an objective sense that apply all the time everywhere, which seems to implicitly undermine then the idea of morality itself, and we'll say more about that here in a little bit. And then we talked about the idea of will to power, right, his basic view of what it means to be alive, and how that's very similar to what Rand had to say, left to our own devices, we would act just as the rest of nature does, or, all other living things. Namely, as Nietzsche would say, with this idea of will to power, we're going to do whatever we need to do to survive and flourish. And that oftentimes will entail exploiting, our environment to include sometimes other living entities. That's just how nature works, Nietzsche would argue. So we'll flesh some of that out. And again, Nietzsche is all about honesty. And of course, ideally, he prefers this master mentality. Okay? And we'll talk about, how that's the case in some of what we say in this video. This idea is we'll flesh out towards the end of this video. that in terms of measuring our progress, we'll see that he wants to suggest we ought to cater to, considerations of quality as opposed to quantity. We ought to focus on the higher individuals, the better amongst us, and making sure they are uplifted and they flourish and survive, even if it's the extent, of most of us, right, or quantity, right? So maybe less of us survive, or we would survive not as long, right? But at least we live an interesting life worth living, Nietzsche's going to argue. But more on that, obviously, as we move along. So speaking of this video, then we'll dive in more detail into this distinction, right? We'll apply it to what we've been talking about in the course, morality, and how this fundamental difference in our existential attitude, whether we are life affirmers or life negators, how then that sort of underlies this distinction as it applies to then master and slave moral theories and what he has to say about morality. So that'll all become clear here in a moment, and then we'll establish the fact, obviously, in doing all this, that Nietzsche himself is going to be a master, which essentially amounts to one, with respect to morality, it amounts to one who does not have a moral lens, does not view things as though there is a proper way that we ought to behave, or that view values as if there's a certain set of values that we all ought to subscribe to. Um, Rather, in being a master, you have moved beyond good and evil. There goes Nietzsche. Down goes Nietzsche, as one of his better known works, right, implores us to do. Move beyond good and evil. The master effectively does that. And so, since he's a master, right, he's a moral skeptic, and so we'll make that perfectly clear. And we'll end by, as I mentioned, talking about how we ought to judge progress, talking about how he's completely misunderstood oftentimes, uh, including, this whole expression that God is dead, and how he worries, right, about, the possibility that slaves will become worse slaves, right? There's that spectrum. And we have mild nihilism, all nihilism's bad, right? But we have milder forms, and then we have the full-blown extreme nihilists like Schopenhauer, where nothing about life seems redeeming. And again, Nietzsche's worried about that. We'll talk about that more, and then we'll talk about what our reading was about. This idea of historicity, our ability to become historical, as Nietzsche would say, contrasted with a regular or different type of animal, and most other animals, right, who are completely unhistorical, that are completely in the moment. And I'll mention how I've alluded to in the first video and elsewhere that this wasn't necessarily my favorite selection from Nietzsche if you're going to talk about morality, right? But you do see all the things we've talked about kind of shining through in what he says in this passage, and we can apply it, and we will apply it to his thoughts about morality and his more general philosophy as well. And I'll try to break down as best I could kind of what I think he was up to in that passage, obviously, and then also give you kind of a little brief criticism of that, what he's up to in that passage. So that's the game plan. I guess I'll end with Nietzsche. Then I like to end Nietzsche with Nietzsche himself via his quotes, some quotes of his, kind of summarizing everything we've talked about. I think, as I mentioned in the first video, Nietzsche is extremely quotable. You probably, maybe without knowing it, you've probably run into numerous Nietzsche quotes yourself. Maybe you've seen the "God is dead" quote. I have a vivid memory of actually in my undergrad when I was going into my dorm, someone had taped up on the door a sign that said this: "God is dead." Whoops. Do I know how to write a D? God is dead, and then it had Nietzsche, and then it said Nietzsche is dead dash God. Anyway, I always found that kind of funny. Maybe you've encountered some Nietzschean quotes yourself. God is dead. Like, I was actually familiar with Nietzsche. If I hadn't known that already, I guess in the on the paper it did say dash Nietzsche there, but maybe you run across that you didn't necessarily know it was Nietzsche, but odds are you probably encountered many a Nietzsche quote in your day. And so we'll let him do some talking at the end and kind of summarize everything that we've said in both the part 1 and part 2 videos. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into this slave versus master distinction. So I've already mentioned how, again, this is fundamentally a distinction with regard to our attitude towards life. And more generally, do we embrace life in its entirety, including all the pain and suffering that might be implicit, no doubt is implicit in it, including the dangerousness it entails, the fact that we don't know, right? It is moment by moment. We never know what's coming next. We might lose it all in the next moment. That is life. That is reality, right? Again, do we accept that, embrace it, to not deceive ourselves about that, right? And embrace it in its entirety? Okay, then we're life affirmers. Okay, so we say yes to love. Okay? But on the other hand, right, if we don't, we're nihilists. Okay, so I guess I could begin by saying that, right? What we've been referring to as nihilism or nihilists, i.e., slaves. Okay, they are slaves. They're saying no to life to some extent. Okay, either in that more mild form that we've talked about, or in the full-blown extreme form, a la Schopenhauer, where nothing seems off the table, like suicide. Again, life doesn't seem redeeming. Life doesn't seem worth living at all, right? Again, the strategy seemed to be you're best off just not investing yourself in what transpires. Investing yourself as little as possible, and that way, when things don't go right, when you feel dissatisfied, inevitably, the experience won't be quite as bad as it might have otherwise been. Again, that's what it comes down to for Nietzsche. That's a sickly mentality, as we'll see, right, for Nietzsche. That's, again, one of the defining features for slaves, and that's indicative of them saying no to life, them being a nihilist. And by the way, so this is slide 10 of the lecture notes. So we're fleshing out kind of the slave mentality first, but again, it's kind of so slides 10 and 11 are me detailing the slave mentality, but then the following 2 slides, the master mentality, right, is basically saying the opposite, as we'll see. So slaves have a weak and diseased constitution, right? They're weak and diseased psychologically, mentally, and I elaborated on that a bit in the first video as well. Again, given that their comfort, right, is they're preoccupied with comfort. Okay? They can't handle the truth of reality, and so they basically, of course, this isn't, again, usually something that's they're conscious of or that's explicit, but everything they do is driven by this subconscious, most of the time, desire to render life as comfortable as possible as they, barely endure and get by till the relief that is the end, that is death. Okay? It's that sense in which they're thought to be weak and diseased, as illustrated again by as he would say, their highest value is comfort. Now, to be clear, the problem isn't that they value comfort, okay? It's okay to want a comfortable life, that's fine to value. The problem is that it's steering and dictating everything the slave does. Of course, unbeknownst to them most of the time, right? It's the impetus for morality itself, Nietzsche would say, for believing in beings that we can't see, taste, feel, etc. Nietzsche would argue, right? God, or the various beliefs that are found in religion. Right? That's the reason. That's the source. Is because most of us can't handle reality as it is. Right? We get bogged down by the fact that there's pain and suffering in life, that there is this element of danger implicit in every waking moment because we don't know what's going to happen. So most of us, right, as a result, as a psychological sort of tendency, okay, we implicitly try to make it, and it makes sense, right? Why not? Make things as comfortable as possible. But for Nietzsche, that's not indicative of a strong, healthy soul that can, again, just accept things for how they are, right, and live life accordingly, right? And not have everything they do dictated, oftentimes, not being aware of it, right, but dictated by their attempt to minimize the pain and suffering by way of making things more comfortable. Okay? As is the case with traditional moral theories, where we're trying to get everybody on board with the idea that certain predictable ways of behaving are the proper ways of behaving. What do we do in effect if we're successful? If we get everybody on board, well, we render their behavior more predictable, and thus we reduce the danger in life. Okay? There's a reason why slave moral theories are popular, Nietzsche would say. Why so many of us subscribe to them? Because insofar as they work, they really do get what we want. They make us our lives more comfortable because they render other people's behavior more predictable, right? Because we get them to believe that they ought not to steal our stuff or so on and so forth. Right? But of course, Nietzsche is going to argue that that comes at a big cost, right? And we'll elaborate on that in a moment when we go through with the master values. Okay, but so we're getting kind of a sense though for the slave mentality, and of course what underlies then all these slave moral theories according to Nietzsche. Okay, that's this weak and diseased psychological constitution that then yields um, a person that is constantly doing things catering to this. I want to reiterate, as I mentioned, in the part one video, that this distinction, right? The crux of the matter, it again comes down to our fundamental existential attitude towards life. It doesn't hinge on how much money we make, the color of our skin, the color of our eyes, the color of our hair, thank goodness, right? Uh, Whether you're a master, all it boils down to is whether or not you do this sort of stuff, or whether or not you do this sort of stuff, right? So again, have you can have the life of a homeless individual and still be a master by all means from Nietzsche's account. Again, it's how do you tend, I would say, right, tend to view life as demonstrated through your expressed views and not such explicit views. What sort of are you religious and so on. So what behaviors do you engage in? Of course, he would, again, the point being here, he would say those are suggestive then of also what's going on with you with respect to you psychologically. Okay. Uh, so let's get back over to this, the good versus evil. I get to this on the bottom of 10. When he talks about values from the perspective of the slave, he uses this contradistinction between good on the one hand and evil. And I think, in part it's just to be clear what perspective he's talking about when he's referencing values at different points in the discussion. All right, but good and evil. So how this from the slave mentality and how the slave characterizes values, that's one thing versus how the master is going to do it. Okay, that's going to be another. Right, so when discussing values from the slave perspective, Nietzsche uses the terms or the labels good and evil. Okay? And what does good mean? Basically, whatever's normal, okay? Because that's again makes things more predictable and makes things more comfortable because we have less unexpected stuff happen. Okay? As I pointed out again at the bottom of slide 10 here, what's evil? All that's different, new, unexpected, most importantly, potentially dangerous. That's ultimately what gets rendered evil from this slavish mentality and the slave moral theories that are propagated by this slave mentality. That's what good and thus evil come to mean. Now, in general, right, these values, the good ones and the evil ones, are viewed through a moral lens, right? They're viewed as if there's certain ones that are proper to have, and there are certain ones that you ought not to have, ideally, right? And that's not going to be the case then for the masters, right? There's no moral undertones when it comes to what the master values and how they view those values. They don't deceive themselves into thinking that there's something special about certain values they have and that there's something problematic then or wrong about others if they don't also subscribe to those certain values, which actually then speaks to this point, right? The slave, with respect to their values, they're outwardly oriented. There's this constant concern for others and what others value, right? And are they valuing the right thing? I.e., are they valuing things and doing things that won't pose a threat to us, right? That are comfortable for us, that will not diminish the comfort that we experience, more or less, right? So there's this constant with respect to the life that the slave lives and the values outward. This is supposed to say outwardly, right? There's this constant outward orientation towards the adoption, endorsement, however you want to put it, and of these various values. This focus on others, where that again is going to be completely lacking when it comes to the master. So there's this attempt on the slave's part. Maybe it's by way of propagating traditional moral theories to get others to come on board with the same values they have, to subscribe, right? To generate a uniformity in value. Why? Again, to make things more comfortable. This again is indicative of their weak soul or their weak constitution, their inability to handle things otherwise. They have to go about things this way, Nietzsche argues. So generally such attempts on the part of the slave, being so outwardly oriented, creating and promulgating these traditional moral theories, their attempts on their part, whether explicitly or not, to diminish the pain and suffering the slaves are experiencing in their life as they eke by until the inevitable relief that is death for them. Again, so says Nietzsche. So they do all this, they cater to this sort of thing, okay? Cater to comfort when they could be instead doing things that would make things more interesting, create works of beauty that are, again, that make us marvel and that make things, interesting and worth waking up in the morning for. If this wins out, the concern for Nietzsche is, if they're successful in their outward orientation and their attempt to get everybody on board with thinking and doing the same thing, okay, more of us might live and for longer, but then what is that going to look like? What sort of existence is that going to be? Is that a life worth living? When everyone thinks and behaves the exact same way, everyone is just a copy of a copy of a copy, where no one seems to be doing anything significant, right? They're just boring, insignificant copies of one another, right? Insofar as they're all subscribing to the same theories and acting and believing the same ways and so on. You get the idea, right? So you do get this idea on the part of Nietzsche that, again, slaves create nothing new, nothing unique or interesting happens. In fact, as he says in The Gay Science, quote, what is new, however, is always evil to the herd. And by the way, the herd, sometimes you hear Nietzsche reference the herd, that's just slaves. It's kind of a derogatory way for him to refer to the slaves, the slave mentality, right? The herd, the masses of people who just go along with the norm because it is more comfortable. Right? So, as I mentioned, this is on slide 11 in the middle of it. So he takes someone like Socrates' moral theory, okay, as a good example of what the slave aspires, to procure, right? What the slave mentality, what sort of existence it yearns for, right? To consider that Socrates says things like, quote, so that we may all be friends and as nearly alike as possible, all steered by the same thing. This is exactly, what Nietzsche would say is befitting of the slave mentality. This is what they want. Everyone to think and believe and do the same exact thing. Because again, it means life won't be as dangerous. Okay? It will be more comfortable. But will it be as interesting? Again, that's Nietzsche's issue. So fear about the truth of existence, okay, that it entails pain and suffering, that it is dangerous, so on and so forth, plagues this herd mentality. And so again, these kinds of illusions, this sort of process, this concern for everyone else, all of this is born out of this inability to handle reality as it actually is. Okay? So the herd seeks the contentment and sense of security evoked in its commitment to the good and to dogmatic, idealistic beliefs in general. Right? Follow these moral theories, right? And in doing so, again, we really do render life more comfortable. Okay? More of us do survive for longer. Okay? So these beliefs do protect the herd from the dangers in life by imploring all to be obedient, to be good, and in essence to be normal and less dangerous, most importantly. So, as Nietzsche famously suggests, fear is the mother of all morals. And again, this is for the slave mentality, for slave moral theories. That's the case, right? Fear, this concern for the pain and suffering, and conversely, the way you could phrase it is this preoccupation with comfort. It's the mother of all moral theories, slave moral theories. So turning to slide 12, you can basically just flip everything around for the master. So master morality says yes, right? So as we'll see, master morality or master moral theory, there really isn't a moral theory then, but more on that in a moment, right? So the master says, as an individual, the master mentality says yes to life in its entirety. Okay, it acknowledges, hey, some of life sucks. There's pain and suffering. We don't know what's coming next. But that's just how life is, right? The master is strong enough and healthy enough to handle that truth without needing to indulge, create, and then indulge in these various, self-deceptions, Nietzsche would say, these various illusions. So, since that's the case, apply that to morality, which is a self-deception according to Nietzsche. Well, the master moves, as I mentioned before, beyond good and evil, right? They move beyond the tendency to view things in moral terms at all. Okay. So a master doesn't attempt to persuade others to assimilate their thoughts. They don't have that outward orientation, okay, regarding their values. There's not this constant concern with what their neighbors are valuing and whether that might or might not pose a threat. Okay? Granted, their neighbors might pose a threat, right? But they're not so preoccupied with the possible pain and suffering and dangerousness of life that it dictates everything they do, right? To such a degree, in fact, that they are willing to deceive themselves psychologically, right? Into thinking there are like moral truths or objective standards and so on and so forth. Okay. In fact, he's going to argue one who properly understands their value, they actually keep their way of doing things to themselves because they appreciate that precisely is wherein true value lies, is in difference, uniqueness, right? There is no, so Nietzsche wants to argue, right? There is no, true value lies in being different. That's what makes something appreciable to begin with. And so the master seems to recognize this. And I think maybe that didn't make a lot of sense, but the way he expresses it, so this is the bottom of slide 12, I think kind of helps, portray what I mean there. So he says, quote, "My judgment is my judgment. One must shed the bad taste of wanting to agree with many. Good is no longer good when one's neighbor mouths it. And how should there be a common good? The term contradicts itself. Whatever can be common always has little value." So the idea, again, true value lies in being different, being recognizable in the first place, and not just being a copy of a copy of a copy. You don't want to be on board with everyone else and have everyone else on board with, what your way of looking at things and whatever it is you happen to value and so on and so forth. So you get this idea that masters create their own values. Right? They aren't just boring and insignificant copies of one another. Okay? At this point in my face-to-face classes, I always ask, has anyone ever heard of Aleister Crowley? And usually no one's heard of Aleister Crowley. I'm surprised that I don't even know how I initially got onto Aleister Crowley. I've got a few of his works. But then I say, have you ever heard of Jimmy Page? And inevitably one or two, fewer and fewer hands, unfortunately, go up. But, some of them will raise their hands and, I'll explain, well, the reason, well, Jimmy Page, the guitarist for Led Zeppelin. I'll say then, anybody heard of Led Zeppelin? And then usually I get most hands up. And I'll say, Jimmy Page, guitarist of Led Zeppelin, big fan of Aleister Crowley. Of course, all of this is a huge, giant, long aside, for me bringing it up in the first place. Why do I even mention Aleister Crowley? Because you might have heard of this phrase. So this comes out of his Diary of a Drug Fiend. Again, Aleister Crowley says, "Do what thou will shall be the whole of the law." And you might have heard of that, right? Again, that's Aleister Crowley Jimmy Page, I don't know if I actually made the connection, but from Led Zeppelin, was a fan of Aleister Crowley, bought his old mansion and so on and so forth. Okay, but the only thing relevant here is this adage, right, that you find in one of Crowley's works, where it's "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," and that the reason I bring that up is that encapsulates sort of the master's perspective. There is no proper certain way you ought to behave, right, or certain values you ought to subscribe to. Do what thou wilt. That's the whole of the law. That's all there is to it. Do whatever you will. Right? Now, of course, why are people immediately, maybe James Rachel's, for example, why are they immediately sort of on edge about hearing that? Well, does that mean anything goes? Well, why can't Nietzsche or a moral skeptic, say, hey, we acknowledge this, but then, make Hobbesian sort of arguments for a contract, right? And conceding that it won't be in their interest, right? Even though there's no proper way you ought to behave, it nevertheless isn't in my interest to do whatever I want, right? So, I mean, it doesn't mean, the point here, right, is that because one is a moral skeptic doesn't mean that one has to be, for letting anything go, just willy-nilly. It doesn't mean anarchy necessarily, or so it's one thing to, I guess, how would I put it? It's one thing to say something about whether or not there are moral truths or standards. It's another thing to say something about how, what's in our best interest in terms of behaving or acting certain ways, right? I don't know. Hopefully that made some sense. And so I don't know. Maybe that's defending, because people, I think, why am I defending moral skepticism? Because so many people, so many of us, right, find that implicitly. We're so used to the opposite, and we're, I guess, kind of, what would it entail to acknowledge there's no such thing as morality? Does it entail a state of chaos? Does that necessarily implied? And I guess I just wanted to caution us, for Nietzsche's sake, maybe that doesn't necessarily have to follow. It's one thing to speak to, the truth of moral standards, the idea of moral standards in the first place, and it's another thing to speak to what's, pragmatic in terms of getting by in our everyday lives, nonetheless. Whatever might be true in philosophy class, right? Anyway, so when discussing, this was obviously implied earlier, but when discussing values from the master's perspective, he uses the contradistinction good and bad. So good from the master's perspective just indicates whatever they happen to value. I value a murderless society. I value vanilla ice cream. You don't? Okay. Right. Whatever they don't value, that's bad. Whatever they happen to not value, whatever they happen to not like. The point is there's no moral undertones. There's no suggestion that, hey, you don't value vanilla ice cream, there's something wrong with you. Right? There's no moral undertones at all for the master, from the master's perspective. Obviously, there's, the idea is with respect to valuing vanilla ice cream, neither side is going to look at you strangely, right? But if you don't value a murderless society, well, this camp's going to suggest there's something wrong with you, whereas the master, again, isn't. Okay. Now I bring up Ayn Rand here at the bottom of slide 13, suggesting that, hers is kind of most indicative of the master moral theory. And I guess I want to qualify that more than it might actually be in the stated in the notes itself. I mean, she would not, technically speaking, be a master from Nietzsche's perspective. Although she comes very, very close, right? She still does seem to suggest there is such a thing as morality, a proper way to behave. It's just really weird because it's completely at odds with what all these other obviously slave moral theories suggest. And sacrificing yourself, she says, there is the right way to behave, but it's doing whatever you want. So it's really weird because it's almost a master. It's almost where Nietzsche is, but she still seems to, again, cling on or hold on to that idea that there is a proper way to behave, whereas Nietzsche wants to move. Right? He's past that. So she's ethical egoist. He's a moral skeptic. They're not quite in the same place. But prefacing the point then at the bottom of slide 13, right? Of all the people we've talked about up to this point, Rand most epitomizes, a master, or her moral theory would most epitomize, the master's moral theory. Like I intimated earlier, though, for the masters, there really is not a moral theory, right? Because they move beyond morality altogether. Right? And hence, me putting moral theory there for Nietzsche's moral theory in quotes, right? Because it's not really a moral theory. What he offers us is really a critique of all moral theories. And remember his, naturalistic account. So on the top of slide 14, I just recall, right, that naturalistic account, it fundamentally is at odds, and that reductionist account of reality, it's fundamentally at odds with the idea that there are these objective, fixed standards that apply all the time to begin with. Instead, there's just a constant struggle for power amidst all these competing life drives, Nietzsche would say. Okay? Some of which are going to win and some of which are going to lose, and that's just the fact of life. Right? So all we do have in reality, from Nietzsche's perspective and from the master's perspective, are these subjective values. I value murderless society. I value vanilla ice cream. Okay? And the master doesn't deceive themselves about that. They don't take the moral step and try to objectify certain values, certain ways of behaving. Okay? Because in doing so, of course, by definition, then they become slaves. They don't do that. They don't take that moral step. They don't view things through that moral lens. Okay. That's that. Turning to slide 15. So I've kind of, hinted at this a few different times in, these two videos. Right? So, how would we judge progress? Are we making progress? Or what's even the right way to think of us progressing, succeeding, if you will? Well, that's going to look like it's going to look like something completely different if you ask a slave versus a master like Nietzsche. Okay? And so, maybe I want to erase these now. So, I don't know that this is necessarily the best way to put it or couch it, but it's the way I've always done it, including in my dissertation when I discuss Nietzsche, because I discuss a similar point here. So, what the slave's really after, I would put it in the terms of, it's quantity. It emphasizes quantity. How do we assess if we're progressing or how well the human race is doing, so to speak? Well, how many of us are surviving and for how long? What's the average life expectancy and so on and so forth? And again, so far as these traditional moral theories that are facilitated by slaves, and insofar as they succeed, people do subscribe to them, well, then we see this being catered to, right? People, because, they don't do as many unexpected, dangerous things, more people, and because they think don't steal from each other, don't hurt each other, because they buy on board, they're on board with all that. We really do, and might see, I should say, a rise in our life expectancy versus, alternatives, let's say. So more of us survive and for longer. I could have said that very simply. We see that, at least compared to the alternative, if non-slavish sort of mentality wins out. Right? We might see improvement here, okay? But at what cost? Again, Nietzsche's going to emphasize we lose in this sense. Okay? If this side wins, well, we lose here. Okay? So the master, someone like Nietzsche, wants to emphasize the opposite. Don't worry about how many survive. In fact, be okay with acknowledging that people aren't equal and that we might have to. This is what really rubs a lot of people the wrong way. And you could see why maybe Hitler would take it and run with it, right? We might have to, how would you put it, elevate, I guess, the higher beings, if you will, right? Or the masters, those that are most promising, Nietzsche would say, who will make things most interesting, that will render life most worth living. We ought to even, did I say ought? Did Nietzsche say ought? Ought to elevate, do what we can to elevate, right, them, even if it entails maybe sacrificing those who aren't, of such a character, you might say. So far from treating everyone equally and insisting that everyone, live for everyone together, live for as long as possible, Nietzsche actually seems to argue the opposite, right? That um, let's in fact sacrifice, if necessary, if it'll help, right? Facilitate the lives of those who are better among us, so be it. That's how nature works, Nietzsche would say, right? That you just see this play out in nature. And it sounds really cold and calculating as I put it here. It doesn't have to be, the case where people die in order to, but it's just in general, right? He wants to argue, why not instead cater to those, why not instead cater to facilitating the lives of those who seem to be doing unique, interesting things, right? Who aren't doing the ordinary, average, everyday thing, right? And who can thus make things more interesting, make life better in a qualitative sense, right? So if the master mentality, someone like Nietzsche wins out, the idea is, okay, given the alternative, maybe fewer of us live, or we live shorter lives, but the life we live is going to be worth, it's going to be worth living more, let's say. Okay? So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Um, so insofar as how I put it at the bottom 15, insofar as the herd prevails, okay, there is a real tangible security that gets fostered, but again, at what cost? So this is buttress, but then it's at the expense of this, Nietzsche would say. So while quantitatively humankind gains from such efforts, more of us survive for longer. Qualitatively, we lose some degree of distinction, some value, Nietzsche would say, right? Insofar as we insist on making everyone a copy of the copy, right? We're making things qualitatively worse then. We're losing some degree of distinction. We could make things more interesting. So normality may yield numbers, but only distinction produces greatness, significance, and beauty. Okay, turning to slide 16. I've also hinted at this throughout a lot of what's been said, but I wanted to talk a moment about this and kind of elaborate a little bit on this. And again, that spectrum of nihilism. So we have extreme, or versus more, more mild versions. Right. So again, the idea is, who's here? Someone like Schopenhauer, and all religious, moral, all religious individuals, for the most part, from Nietzsche's perspective, are going to be at least here. You believe in morality, you're going to be at least here, right? So all nihilists, the idea is, are somewhere on the spectrum, okay? But, right, there are some versions of nihilism that are worse than others. There are some nihilists who are worse than others, Nietzsche, would argue. And so when he has Zarathustra, famously, and thus spoke Zarathustra, descend down the mountain and speak at the marketplace to the rabble, the herd, who just kind of laugh at him ultimately. He shouts, "God is dead and we've killed him." First of all, what does he mean? He means that with the Nietzsche's kind of predicting that with the continued increase in the influence of science and logic and so on, again, Nietzsche arguing this, that people in general won't be able to help but see through some of these deceptions. They won't be able to help but see through their own self-deception with respect to God, right? And these religious illusions that they were formerly able to hold because they didn't, this scientific and logical way of thinking wasn't as ingrained in our everyday existence as it is nowadays. Before they were able to hold that, but now, right, as time progresses, they're going to be less and less able to sort of kid themselves, if you will, until eventually they're not able to retain that any longer. But this is a problem for Nietzsche because, again, what gave rise to this in the first place? Their inability to deal with reality. So what happens when you take this life-preserving error, as he calls it, away, and you throw them back to square one? where they're confronted with an existence that they can't handle. They can't handle the truth, right? Well, you're hearing science and logic, right? We've killed God through our science and logic, through our increased emphasis on science and logic. Again, Nietzsche progressing what's going to happen for the great multitude of us, and you might argue that you see this borne out. At least it seems like fewer people are religious nowadays versus Nietzsche's day, for example. I'm not saying he's right or right or wrong, but so he's predicting this sort of thing happening, and this is a worry. So you might think, well, Nietzsche, he doesn't believe in God. He's great thing, right? Zarathustra doesn't believe in God, great thing. No, the worry is what's going to happen to all the slaves, who are thrust back into this predicament they started with, and now they don't have recourse to at least this kind of illusion. And so that's the worry, and that's not oftentimes appreciated, by people that come across this expression. Maybe it's not, it's very, very seldom appreciated, I think. By the way, I've written on this with respect to Nietzsche. If Nietzsche truly believes all this, what is he himself doing? If he thinks that most people can't handle reality, what is he doing enlightening them to that fact? Is he not hastening their own demise, especially in helping them see through their own illusions? Is he not doing this precisely himself? I mean, is he really actually even worried? Because he himself seems to be doing the same thing as the science and logic is doing. And so I've written about this too. It seems, how can Nietzsche be consistent here? Is he truly worried about what's going to happen to all the slaves out there, so to speak, when he himself is, again, seemingly shedding light on all the illusory nature of all their beliefs in his own writings? Okay, so, and given what he says, at least, it seems like there's this worry, though, and Zarathustra's worried, what's going to happen when the slave loses this life-preserving air? Are they going to fall victim then to the full-blown version of nihilism and become a Schopenhauer, preach life resignation, commit suicide, who knows, right? That's the ultimate upshot. That's the worry, okay? What happens when we lose these self-deceptions that seem so necessary? So it's best to renounce, obviously, all forms of nihilism, but, is that possible for the large bulk of humanity? It doesn't seem like it. So again, what are you doing, Nietzsche? Okay, but he wants, ideally, you to renounce all of this and just, affirm life in its entirety. So this is the key, right? But are we capable of it? Okay. So now I want to turn my attention to, again, what I think is a somewhat strange selection from Nietzsche. Now, having said that and having reread it again, you can see the things we've talked about applied in this reading, and it is very interesting. I think it's fascinating in its own right, and I don't, I'm not upset that they included it. I just, I wish they would also have included, I guess, maybe the ideal for me would have been to at least include something else, from like, that was more directly addressing his, his take on morality. But let's go ahead and say a little bit about this stuff on historicity that you see in that excerpt. So, what do we mean by this? Our ability to be historical, right? So we live, remember Nietzsche's reductionist view that we talked about in part 1, right? Of reality, right? All we actually have in reality that we can be certain of is the moment, now. And the rest of the animal kingdom, right, is unhistorical in that they live entirely in that moment, right? they don't have this memory, right? This capacity to reflect, to thus seemingly extract themselves from this moment and become historical, to to not be entirely subsumed in the moment, but then have an eye towards, right, the past and the future. And thus, most importantly, for him, it yields all sorts of problems, right? Because what ends up happening, unlike the rest of the animal kingdom, who are completely in the now, so to speak, in the moment, they're constantly doing what's best for themselves, what will further their own existence, their own survival, and their own flourishing. But this capacity to be historical opens up issues for us, right? We can become what he calls historical, the historical type, or the supra historical type. I forgot exactly how he coins that. And both of them have issues, right? So we can be so subsumed in this, what's happened in the past, and sort of focused on what we want to transpire in the future, that we're subsumed in, this sort of historical perspective where we both are sort of living in the past and thinking about the past, and it sort of thrusts us in the future, right? But we have no recognition that really what moves us are, as he says, these unhistorical drives in the first place. That we really have no control over things. We think instead, because we're so historical, as if we can control things and things can get better, and that there will be a difference in the future as opposed to the past, and so on and so forth. Right? That's the type of mentality he means by the historical. We lose sight of the unhistorical. The fact that, in reality, each moment's no different than the next, and we have really no control, Nietzsche would argue, and there's this dangerousness and so on and so forth. The super historical, on the other hand, they have that recognition, and they recognize, as he says, the past is no different than the moment now, and that there's how does he put it, simultaneity. I don't know how to put that. There's no difference, right? There's no reason to expect that things will ever be different, right? That the past is the same as now, okay? And so the issue there is that they kind of lose hope almost, right? They're kind of deadened. It kind of leads to a stupor. So they're wiser in some sense. They have some sort of greater perspective, Nietzsche might say, versus these guys, right? But it kind of leads. It's almost like Schopenhauer's pessimism, though, right? It deadens them, and it's not no longer does it help aid them in what Nietzsche thinks really matters, living life, right? And so they're still, because they see things as sort of superfluous, and they again sort of lose sight of the moment and what really matters, and living passionately in the moment. So ideally, it seems, is the unhistorical the ideal? I don't think, being on par with like the swine or cow as much as we can, is that ideal? I don't think that's not Nietzsche's position, and I think that comes out in what he says in our excerpt, right? There is a line, we can use history, he says, but it's only helpful insofar as we use it for what matters, living now in the moment to prosper and flourish, and we don't kind of lose ourselves, right, as Rand would say, right, in these reflections on the past and so on and so forth. That's again kind of what I take him to be saying. We lose sight again in this capacity to be historical, right? We lose sight of what really matters. But that's not to say that this ability to reflect, right, is that altogether bad? I don't know. No, I don't think so. It clearly says, so long as you're able to use it and immediately discard it, right? Completely, discard it and let it go, and use it for the moment. Then, right? Then it seems to be healthy or good on this account. But so many of us, the issue seems to be we that's not what we do, right? We hold on to it and we end up living historically, right? We completely lose sight of the moment altogether. Okay, that's the upshot. Now on slide 18, I kind of give a brief critique, I should say, of this take, right? He wants to sort of, it seems like, distinguish as if there's a fuller sense of living, right? If, living completely in the moment, which is like, in some sense, being less reflective, living a less intellectual life, that's somehow living a more full or in the moment life. But I don't know, especially I guess my critique would be how someone who's a materialist or a naturalist, I should say, who explains everything in purely natural terms, how they can make such a distinction. Is it wouldn't reflection and intelligence still be just as much, living in the moment, living, since it's an entirely natural process? I mean, why does he want to suggest that being this way is in fact so much worse than one who is completely unhistorical? I mean, on what basis are you even making that sort of judgment, I guess? Given that you're, again, a naturalist in the first place, isn't everything equally a reflection of nature living? I don't know if I put that point very well, but again, that's what I'm trying to draw out on slide 18. So as I've mentioned, I think that's it for now. I guess that's for the whole course. That's pretty much it. I turn now to conclude, as I've suggested I will a few times, conclude this Nietzsche lecture by letting Nietzsche himself talk. So again, Nietzsche, very quotable, and all these quotes I think do a great job of sort of, again, capturing all the points we've raised up to this point. Capturing his more general points, but then also his specific issue then with respect to these typical moral theories that we've talked about all throughout the course, and to the idea of morality in general. So without further ado, bear with me as I read through these. Now, I think I actually lie. On the top of slide 19, I suggest all these are from Beyond Good and Evil, but I know for a fact that one of these is the one on top of slide 20 is actually from, I have a book over here on with his letters that he wrote to various correspondents throughout his life, and that one's from a letter he had to his sister. But I think all the other ones are from Beyond Good and Evil. So he writes, quote, "There are no moral phenomena at all, but only a moral interpretation of phenomena." Arguably the most famous of his morality quotes. Again, there are no moral phenomena at all. There's no such thing as morality, but only a moral interpretation of phenomena. Only moral theories. Quote, "Indeed, it might be a basic characteristic of existence that those who would know it completely would perish, so none of us can handle the truth. In which case, the strength of a spirit should be measured according to how much of the truth one could still barely endure, or to put it more clearly, to what degree one would require it to be thinned down, shrouded, sweetened, blunted, falsified." So he's saying, hey, it might be the case that none of us can handle reality. And so really the strength of a spirit, how do we measure the strength of character and how much self-deception they have to indulge in, right? The strongest among us have to indulge the least in this self-deception. Maybe it's the case that we all have to, right? But the strongest among us will resist this urge and do it the least. Quote, "Perhaps nobody yet has been truthful enough about what truthfulness is," end quote. Okay, top of 20, this is the one to his sister. And I think it's the one, did I allude to this? Was this might have been the first part. The whole idea of ignorance is bliss. Do we have two competing paths here? Oh boy. Right, or maybe this is a false dilemma, who knows? Okay. But Nietzsche, I alluded to this quote, right? Nietzsche seems to suggest through things like this that, there might be something to this idea. Okay, and in which case, maybe I should have mentioned this at the beginning, before you took an entire course in philosophy, right? Which is presumably helping us, right, down this path, right? Maybe I should have warned you, if this is all true, if what you really cared about is this, don't take the course. So he writes to his sister, quote, "Every true faith is indeed infallible. It performs what the believing person hopes to find in it, but it does not offer the least support for the establishing of an objective truth. Here the ways of men divide. If you want to achieve peace of mind and happiness, then have faith. If you want to be a disciple of truth, then search. End quote. And then we'll end with the one most applicable to the issue of morality itself. Is there such a thing as morality in the first place? Never mind what the proper moral theory is, which we busied ourselves with the entire course. Let's back up. Is there such a thing as morality itself? He writes, quote, in all sciences of morals, ethical philosophy, all these moral philosophers and what they're up to. Quote, in all sciences of morals, so far one thing was lacking, strange as it may sound, the problem of morality itself. What was lacking was any suspicion that there was something problematic here. What the philosophers called a rational foundation for morality and tried to supply was, seen in the right light, merely a scholarly variation of the common faith in the prevalent morality. A new means of expression for this faith, certainly the very opposite of an examination, analysis, questioning, and vivisection of this very faith. In other words, all these prior moral theorists, with the exception maybe Ayn Rand, none of them actually questioned morality itself. Rather, they just took what they were, some might argue, conditioned to think and believe, and tried to offer a rational justification for it, right? They wrote ethical philosophy books in defense of that popular, common, everyday view of morality, right, that they grew into. But they never actually questioned morality itself, which, of course, Nietzsche thinks is what he does, which is why he arrives at moral skepticism and the idea that there is nothing to it, no such thing as morality. And with that, I leave you. That's the end of our ethics course. I'll leave you with our reflection time questions. I will post another video, just a short video to wrap up with some concluding remarks about the course in general and grading the final quiz and so on. So I'll post that, but we'll end this lecture then by bringing us full circle. You might recall in the initial reflection time questions for lecture 1, I asked you to assess the degree to which you used moral terms, the degree to which you reflected on them, and so on. So here I ask you to now, having gone through all these various justifications for using these terms and so on, and then also getting Nietzsche's take. Is there such thing as morality? Okay, that's question 1 here. Okay. Is there no such thing as morality? And if that's the case, if Nietzsche's right, if that's ultimately where you end up, going back full circle then to the questions in lecture 1, are you prepared to stop saying things like, Sally's so wrong to do that? How could she? Or are you going to still, nevertheless, say she's wrong, even though you concede there's no reason to? Right? We have to, if we give Nietzsche his position, then, and this is Rachel's worry, presumably, right? You better not, if you're going to be consistent, you better not keep saying things like that. You better not be making these moral judgments, okay? Or you at least shouldn't be if you are consistent. And what about, so question 2 then is, what do you make of that notion of kind of changing the way so many of us tend to think of progress, right? And measuring success and progress in terms of how interesting life is or the quality of our life, and focusing on that rather than focusing on, as he would say, slaves do, right? Ensuring we live as long as possible, right? As many as possible of us live for as long as possible. So what do you think about that juxtaposition in terms of what matters most? And that's it. Like I said, I'll for those of you taking the course, I'll post a video to wrap up the course and give a few concluding remarks. Again, hold back the tears. I know it's going to be tough not having another lecture to look forward to, right? Please. But I will say actually, I'll speak to, for example, in that concluding video, I'll talk about, if you are interested, if you did find some of this interesting, what you can do as a next step, some other classes or on your own, what you can do. So with that, though, we'll go ahead and end our lecture 18 on our part 2 video, the lecture 18 on moral skepticism. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.